Hello, welcome to the Delaware Continuum of Care Funding Committee orientation. I'm Christy Rubenstein from DMA, and we provide consulting services to the Delaware Continuum of Care for the CoC funding competition. I'm going to be leading you through this slide deck. Let's get started. This orientation will cover a few different topics. We'll start with an overview of the CoC program, then move on to an overview of the CoC NOFO competition. We'll talk through CoC funding and then finish up with timing and responsibilities. We'll start off with an overview of the CoC program, talking through the CoC program interim role in order to better understand why the CoC evaluates projects. Let's start off by reviewing some key parts of the CoC interim rule that relate to the work of the funding committee. This slide includes excerpts from Subpart B, Establishing and Operating a Continuum of Care. This part of the interim rule covers the formation of the local continuum of care and its board and outlines its responsibilities. Responsibilities of the CoC include operating the CoC, designating and operating a Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, and advancing continuum of care planning. I'll talk more about the ways that this section relates to project evaluation in the next slides. The CoC is also charged with preparing an application for funds. This refers to the CoC's application for CoC program funds, which is what this committee will be working on over the coming months. I'll talk in more detail about this section in a bit. This slide covers some of the detail for the part of the interim rule regarding operating the CoC that relates to evaluating performance. Under the CoC program interim rule, CoCs are required to evaluate the performance of the recipients and subrecipients of program funds. First, in consultation with recipients and subrecipients, the CoC is responsible for establishing performance targets that are appropriate for population and program type. An example of a population might be families with children. An example of a program type might be permanent supportive housing. The CoC is then responsible for monitoring recipient and subrecipient performance, evaluating outcomes, and taking action against poor performers. Note that taking action does not have to mean taking a punitive action. The CoC could provide poor performers with technical assistance and require improvement plans as a means to strengthen the overall system rather than let poor performance continue unchecked. The CoC has the responsibility of measuring performance at the system level and the project level, including outcomes of projects funded under both the CoC and ESG programs. CoCs are required to set project-level targets. For example, the CoC may establish a target of having 90% of clients in rapid rehousing exiting to a permanent housing destination. CoCs are encouraged to set system targets and measure performance on a regular basis. An example of this would be if the CoC establishes a target of exiting 75% of clients across all CoC projects to a permanent housing destination. HUD has advised that when considering taking action against poor performers, CoCs should think about how project-level performance impacts system-level performance. Because the system-level performance is a reflection of how individual projects are performing, it's important for CoCs to understand the connections between project and system performance. Another duty that the CoC has as part of operating the CoC is to establish written standards. CoCs must work with their ESG recipients to develop written standards for providing CoC assistance that must cover at least the following: the CoC's eligibility policies and procedures beyond minimum HUD regulatory requirements, how the CoC will determine and prioritize eligible persons for transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. This should reflect the standards established for the CoC's coordinated assessment or entry system, and what the CoC has determined to be the appropriate levels of rapid rehousing rental assistance and participant rent contribution across projects. The CoC's performance targets and monitoring of projects should factor in the CoC's written standards. As the previous slide indicated, CoCs are charged with creating various standards for providing assistance. As such, HUD guidance to CoCs often refers to the CoC's written standards. This slide shows a couple of examples of where HUD's guidance differs back to the CoC's written standards. CoC-funded projects must comply with the CoC's written standards as long as those standards are aligned with CoC regulations. I won't go through these examples in detail, but feel free to pause the video to read through them if you would like to do so. As we mentioned earlier, the interim rule also calls upon CoCs to prepare an application for funds for the CoC program competition. Specifically, the CoC must design, operate, and follow a collaborative process for the development of applications and approve the submission of applications in response to a NOFA published by HUD. The CoC must also establish priorities for funding projects in the CoC's geographic area. Finally, the CoC must designate an eligible applicant to be the collaborative applicant that will collect and combine the required application information from all applicants and for all projects within the CoC that have been selected for funding. The collaborative applicant will also apply for CoC planning activities. In the Delaware CoC, the collaborative applicant is Housing Alliance Delaware. We'll now move on to an overview of the CoC Notice of Funding Opportunity competition. Let's start with some general information about the CoC competition. HUD's Continuum of Care program and Emergency Solutions Grant program provide federal funding for homelessness-related work. Funding under each program can be used only for specific types of projects. While ESG is focused more on meeting emergency housing needs, the CoC program provides more of the funding for medium and long-term housing and service needs, along with funding for CoC planning and systems like HMIS and coordinated entry. CoC program funds are distributed on an annual basis. Each year, HUD releases a Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO for short, for the Continuum of Care program competition to determine which projects will be funded. When HUD issues a CoC program NOFO, the CoC must submit an application to receive funding. In other words, funding is not automatic. Each CoC determines which projects to submit for CoC program funds. As discussed on a prior slide, the collaborative applicant is the entity responsible for submitting the application on behalf of the CoC. HAD is the collaborative applicant for the Delaware CoC. Let's continue on with more information about the CoC competition. Each CoC in the country will submit individual project applications along with the CoC's application to HUD. Although the CoC submits the applications on behalf of agencies requesting funds, HUD will execute individual contracts with recipient agencies for each project that is funded. After submission, HUD reviews the CoC applications from every CoC and scores them. HUD separately reviews project applications to ensure they meet certain quality thresholds. In many years, HUD provides bonus funding, which is funding that CoCs can compete for in order to bring in additional new funding to the CoC. All applications, including the CoC application and all project applications, must be submitted through HUD's online eSNAP system. HUD provides a cap on the amount each CoC can request in both renewed funds and bonus funds. Let's review the timeline for the CoC competition NOFO. The first step in the process is registration, which is how the CoC lets HUD know that it intends to apply for CoC funds. For CoCs, registration signals that the NOFO process has started. Registration opens on the second Tuesday in January and closes in early March. The next step in the process is typically the release of the Grant Inventory Worksheet, or GIW for short. The GIW is the list of the grants up for renewal for the CoC. CoCs and project recipients have an opportunity to review the GIW and request minor changes to HUD. HUD then reviews those requests and issues a final GIW to guide which projects can request renewal. At some point after the initial GIW is released, HUD will release the CoC program NOFO. The CoC program NOFO was released in July in 2019, in September in 2021, and on August 1st in 2022. In 2021, CoCs had 90 days to complete and submit the application. However, in 2022, CoCs had only 60 days to complete and submit the application. Within that window, project applications are due to the local CoC no less than 30 days before HUD's competition deadline. The CoC is required to provide notification no less than 15 days before the due date of all projects accepted or reduced for the CoC's priority list, along with those rejected. The priority list is the list of projects that will be submitted to HUD. HUD requires that the full CoC application be publicly posted 2 days before their submission due date. And finally, the full CoC application and priority list, including all project applications, must be submitted in eSnaps by the deadline. The deadline in 2019 was September 30th. In 2021, it was November 16th, and in 2022, it was September 30th again. Let's talk a little about the parts of the CoC consolidated application. The CoC's consolidated application has 2 parts in eSnaps that must be submitted, the CoC application and the CoC's priority list. The CoC application consists of the CoC level application and a series of attachments. These attachments are documentation backing up assertions made in the application and are typically related to the rating and ranking process, public housing authority preferences policies, and housing and healthcare leverages. The priority list is the summary list of projects that the CoC will submit or has reduced or rejected. The priority list also includes each of the individual project applications being submitted by the CoC for funding consideration, along with required attachments. I'll talk in more detail now about the CoC application. In the CoC application, the CoC must respond to questions about its performance over the last year. It is on this part of the consolidated application that the CoC will be able to describe the work it has done throughout the year and to highlight the CoC's successes and achievements. Many of the questions in the CoC application allow for narrative responses and cover a range of topics such as CoC governance, coordination with other systems, policies, trainings, the CoC's local funding competition, and so on. Methodology of and data from the point-in-time count and the housing inventory chart are also reviewed. And information about how the CoC is working to make progress on various goals, primarily related to strategies to reduce homelessness and improve system performance measures outcomes, are also included. As discussed on the prior slide, the CoC must also submit documentation to demonstrate to HUD that it has met specific targets or requirements established by HUD under the CoC NOFO. On the prior slide, I referred to HUD's system performance measures, also known as the SPMs. These are a series of measures that HUD has created to help evaluate CoC performance across domains related to serving those experiencing homelessness. They include length of time homeless, returns to homelessness, number of homeless persons, jobs and income growth, first-time homeless, stabilizing people in homeless category 3, which does not apply to the CoC, successful placement and retention of housing. You will hear us refer to the SPMs throughout the CoC's local funding competition. They are important because the CoC is supposed to be driving these in the right direction and making improvements on its performance. In fact, HUD scores CoCs on their improvement of SPM outcomes as part of the CoC application. The SPMs are measured using data from HMIS or in your system CMIS. The data input by CoC projects contributes to the CoC's outcomes, so you will see that many of the scoring criteria used to evaluate projects directly or indirectly refer back to the SPMs. CoCs can use the annual project scoring and ranking process to encourage agencies to improve data entry, data quality, and project performance. Let's take a look at how the CoC application has been scored over the last 7 years. As you can see from the table, project ranking, review, and capacity has stayed quite stable, worth roughly 15% of the points throughout the years. We'll review what this section encompasses in more detail on the next slide because the work of the funding committee is directly related. You may notice that since 2021, HUD has shifted a significant number of points into the CoC coordination and engagement section. This section covers items related to governance, coordination with other systems, policies, trainings, and CoC practices. At the same time, HUD has zeroed out the points in the performance and strategic planning section. Most of those points were related to CoC work on reducing homelessness among specific subpopulations. While some of the questions have entirely disappeared from the application, many others are now accounted for in the CoC coordination and engagement section. Additionally, you may notice that system performance was worth fewer points in 2021. This was due to COVID. In 2022, HUD once again returned to scoring CoCs on their SPM data and other outcomes. One final area to note is that the points for coordination with housing and healthcare changed from bonus points in 2021 to regular points in 2022. These points are related to the CoC selecting and submitting project applications that leverage housing and healthcare resources from outside the CoC. As I mentioned on the prior slide, HUD scores the CoC on various aspects of its local competition for CoC funds. Let's break down the different elements that HUD scores CoCs on as this relates to the work that the Funding Committee and the Non-Conflicted Board will be undertaking over the coming months. Generally speaking, HUD grants points to CoCs that run a transparent and fair local competition that is also data-driven. The 30 points awarded in 2022 for what HUD refers to as project ranking, review, and capacity were distributed in the following way. HUD provided up to 8 points for the use of objective criteria. To earn these points, the CoC had to demonstrate it publicly notified applicants of the criteria being used multiple objective criteria, and gave at least a third of its points for objective criteria. HUD awarded CoCs up to 8 points for the use of criteria related to the system performance measures. To earn these points, the CoC needed to demonstrate it publicly notified applicants of the SPM-related criteria being used. Additionally, HUD was looking for multiple SPM-related criteria to be used, and for at least 20% of the criteria used to be SPM-related. HUD awarded 1 point for the CoC using data from a comparable database to evaluate DV providers. HUD awarded up to 4 points for CoCs that evaluated projects on their ability to successfully house participants in permanent housing, and for looking at how long it takes projects to do so. They also wanted CoCs to account for the severity of barriers experienced by program participants when evaluating projects. HUD also scored CoCs on their work to obtain input and include persons of different races and ethnicities in the development of rating and ranking criteria and in the project review, selection, and ranking process. Additionally, HUD scored CoCs on whether they assessed projects on the degree to which the project identified barriers to participation faced by persons of different races and ethnicities and took steps to eliminate those barriers. Overall promotion of racial equity in the local CoC process was worth 2 points. An additional 4 points were awarded to CoCs that demonstrated either a process to reallocate funds from lower performing projects to create new high performing projects or a history of reallocation. Finally, HUD awarded 3 points to CoCs for having a ranking and selection process that met HUD's deadlines for notifying project applicants of the start of the project application process and whether their application was selected, reduced, or rejected. Let's turn our attention to the other part of the consolidated application, the priority list. The priority list includes all project applications that the CoC has selected for HUD to consider for CoC program funding. Agencies with individual projects selected by the CoC must submit their own project applications to the CoC for inclusion on the priority list. The CoC NOFO requires that the CoC rank all projects except the planning project. Those ranked on the bottom may not receive funding. Projects seeking to renew their grants, also known as renewal projects, typically go through an evaluation process which HUD scores CoCs on, as we just reviewed. Also, as discussed on the prior slide, HUD allows for and encourages CoCs to consider reallocating projects. Fully reallocated projects are not renewed, and the funds are instead directed to another use. Partially reallocated projects have their funding request reduced, but are still submitted on the priority list. Most CoCs will also submit new projects for funding consideration. The CoC must also submit its planning project as part of the priority list. The priority list will include a summary of each of these types of projects, so HUD is clear as to which projects the CoC is asking HUD to fund and in what priority. We'll now go through an overview of CoC program funding. We'll start out with a brief overview of HUD's CoC policy priorities. These priorities were included in the FY 2022 CoC program competition NOFO, and understanding them can provide insight into HUD's expectations for CoCs. I won't go through the details presented on the next few slides, but feel free to pause and review at your own pace if you would like. First, HUD continues to include ending homelessness for all persons as a top policy priority. This includes identifying, engaging, and serving all in your community who experience homelessness, including those from all subpopulations and those who may have the highest needs. The next of HUD's policy priorities is to use a housing first approach, which includes an expectation that CoCs will assess how well housing first approaches are being implemented. Continuing on, this slide shows the third and fourth policy priorities outlined in the FY 2022 CoC NOFO. HUD's third policy priority is reducing unsheltered homelessness, which stresses identification of permanent housing options for those who are unsheltered. The fourth policy priority is improving system performance, which encompasses HUD's expectations that CoCs use the SPMs to assess their effectiveness, that CoCs use the coordinated entry process to effectively serve those seeking assistance, that CoCs evaluate the effectiveness of all renewal projects, and that CoCs embrace continuous quality improvement and other process improvement strategies. HUD has also identified partnering with housing, health, and service agencies as a policy priority. This includes improving how all available resources are utilized using cost performance and outcome data. It also includes maximizing the use of mainstream and other community-based resources, specifically healthcare resources, housing authority or housing agency resources or other housing provider resources, and workforce development resources. The last two of HUD's policy priorities are shown on this slide. HUD identified racial equity as a policy priority, calling upon CoCs to identify and address racial disparities in their local policies, procedures, and processes. HUD also lists engagement of persons with lived experience as a priority, encouraging CoCs to meaningfully involve people with lived experience in CoC planning and in the development and implementation of CoC policies and processes, including through employment opportunities. Let's review the types of projects allowed under the CoC program. The CoC interim rule limits the types of projects that CoC program funds can be used for. Additionally, HUD has essentially phased out some types of projects when it comes to creating new projects under the NOFO. But HUD has also offered additional options using flexibilities in the interim rule. Project types allowed include the following. For housing, CoCs can renew or create projects for permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, which are both considered permanent housing options. CoCs can also renew or create projects through the joint component transitional housing to rapid rehousing project type. which, as it sounds, combines transitional housing and rapid rehousing uses. CoCs can renew transitional housing and safe haven projects, but have not been allowed to create new projects of either type in recent years. For services, CoCs can create supportive services only projects. In recent years, new SSO projects can only be created to fund coordinated entry related activities. This is known as the SSOCE project type. Existing non-CE SSO projects can be renewed, although many previously converted to permanent supportive housing. CoCs can also use the HMIS project type to support homeless management information system related activities. Additionally, CoCs are given a planning project to support CoC planning activities. The planning grant amount is a predetermined portion of the overall CoC funding and is set at 3%, which is also capped at $1.25 million for CoCs where the 3% would exceed that amount. Now, let's take a quick look at funding sources for CoC projects. Unlike many other HUD programs, CoC program funding is not allocated solely through a formula. Instead, CoCs are able to ask HUD to continue to fund or renew existing grants. Each year, as part of the CoC competition, HUD provides CoCs with the list of projects to be renewed and at what funding level. This list is called the Grant Inventory Worksheet, or GIW. CoCs can request that HUD renew each of the projects on the GIW. CoCs also have the discretion to reallocate funds from these renewal projects and redirect those funds to new projects. HUD may also make bonus funds available to CoCs as part of the competition. CoCs can tap into these funds to create new projects. In recent years, HUD has made funds available through a CoC bonus, which can be used to create new projects across a range of project types, and it's generally open to serving all populations and subpopulations experiencing homelessness. HUD has also distributed funds through a DV bonus, which is limited to a subset of project types and which must be used to serve victims of domestic violence experiencing homelessness. For any bonus funds offered, HUD caps the amount that the CoC can ask for. We've mentioned the term reallocation a few times, so let's talk a little about what reallocation is. Simply put, reallocation is the process used by CoCs to take funds from a renewal project and use those funds to create one or more new projects. Funds can either be fully or partially reallocated. A full reallocation is when the CoC reclaims 100% of project funds for another use. A partial reallocation is when the CoC reclaims just a portion of project funds for another use. Let's talk a little more about reallocation. HUD encourages CoCs to reallocate poor performing projects, although these are often difficult decisions for CoCs to make. HUD suggests that CoCs consider whether they can create a new project that will work better than their least well-performing projects. If yes, then CoCs should consider reallocating funds. Sometimes an agency undergoes a voluntary reallocation. Typically, this is when they are looking to combine grants or change a project type, for example, to go from a transitional housing to permanent supportive housing project. CoCs may choose to reallocate funds when projects demonstrate poor performance or compliance issues, an agency consistently fails to spend down all the project funds it has, or projects are no longer aligned with the needs or priorities of the CoC and the community they are serving. If reallocation is due to performance issues, then the CoC would ideally use some type of evaluation process to determine where there are issues with projects. Depending upon the circumstances of the reallocation, a new project solicitation may be needed after reallocation. For example, the CoC may wish to set aside reallocated funds for a specific use, or to serve a specific subpopulation, or there may just be timing issues. Now that we've discussed some basics regarding CoC funding, let's briefly review the tiering structure HUD uses to fund projects. It's important to understand that this is a competition, and HUD doesn't always provide CoCs with 100% of the funds they request. Instead, HUD uses a ranking and tiering strategy, which is passed along to the CoCs to implement on the local level. We'll talk more about the ranking later and focus on the Tier 1 and Tier 2 strategy here. HUD divides the available funding for CoCs into Tier 1 and Tier 2 using a formula outlined in the CoC NOFO each year. Projects that are funded through the amount available in Tier 1 are considered safe and will be funded. In 2022, Tier 1 was 95% of the funds needed to renew all projects. Tier 2 was the amount of CoC bonus funds available, plus the 5% of renewal funds not included in Tier 1. Projects that are funded through the pot of funds set aside for Tier 2 are at risk and may not receive funding. These projects must participate in a national competition for those funds and are scored individually using a formula outlined in the NOFO. This formula factors in the CoC's overall score, along with the project's budget and the budgets of the projects that are ranked above it in Tier 2. Let's continue our discussion of Tier 1 and Tier 2. You can think of Tier 1 and Tier 2 like CoC bank accounts. As you select projects for inclusion in one of these tiers, you are drawing down the balance on that account. The Tier 1 amount is larger, and most projects will be included in Tier 1. The Tier 2 amount is smaller. Most CoCs put a lot of thought about projects going into Tier 2 since the funding for these projects is at risk. There are no HUD rules about which projects must go in Tier 1 or Tier 2. The CoC's prioritization policies and scoring process help determine ranking, which is used to assign projects to Tier 1 or 2. There can be a bit of strategizing to determine which projects go into Tier 2 and in what order. CoCs should provide flexibility for this strategizing in their funding policies. This slide shows the Delaware CoC's funding outcomes from 2013 to 2021. HUD has yet to release 2022 funding competition results, but we can see that the CoC has been able to grow the amount of funds coming into the CoC during that time. Let's take a look at responsibilities and timing, essentially who does what and when. In the Delaware CoC, there are three groups that play a role in the process of evaluating and selecting the projects for which the CoC will request CoC program funding: the funding committee, the non-conflicted members of the board, and the CoC lead. Each has a specific set of duties related to ensuring the CoC submits a fully completed, consolidated application to HUD. Let's review the responsibilities of the funding committee. They include reviewing and recommending funding policies, reviewing and approving the Delaware CoC project applications and scoring tools, reviewing project evaluation outcomes and scoring of projects and approving final scores for both new and renewal projects, evaluating the centralized intake and HMIS projects, making recommendations for reallocations, selecting projects and making ranking recommendations, and placing projects on quality improvement. Let's review the responsibilities of the non-conflicted members of the CoC board. Their responsibilities include the following: reviewing and approving funding committee membership, reviewing and approving the funding policies, reviewing the final scoring, project selection, ranking, and reallocation recommendations made by the funding committee, and approving the final project priority list, reviewing and approving the annual Delaware CoC consolidated application to HUD, reviewing and making final determinations related to appeals. Let's review the responsibilities of the CoC lead agency, which is Housing Alliance Delaware. These include undertaking activities needed for the successful submission of the CoC's consolidated application, managing the Delaware CoC funding process and HUD CoC program NOFO timelines, drafting the Delaware CoC's funding policies for review and approval by the committee, drafting the Delaware CoC's project applications and scoring tools for review and approval by the funding committee, coordinating and managing the project application, evaluation, and scoring process, reviewing project applications to be submitted on the priority list, ensuring the Delaware CoC meets all HUD CoC program NOFO requirements, drafting and submitting the final approved consolidated application on behalf of the Delaware CoC, submitting the CoC planning project, and administering quality improvement plans. Let's review the first step in the annual process, which is to establish the CoC's funding policies for this year's competition. The funding policies at their core will cover the following: evaluation and scoring of renewal projects, new project solicitation and selection, reallocation of projects, prioritization and ranking of projects, and the CoC's appeals policy. This slide covers some issues regarding the timing of various CoC competition-related activities. There are some parts of the CoC competition process that are sequential. Before doing anything else, the CoC should update and adopt its funding policies for the current year. This will lay out the process to be used for evaluation and selection of projects. However, I'll note that the funding policies can be amended if needed to ensure the policies are aligned with the current year's NOFO. The CoC should conduct its renewal project evaluation and/or scoring process before reallocation of poor-performing renewal projects. This will allow the CoC to point to recent or current issues that projects are having as the basis for reallocation. Generally speaking, the CoC's new project solicitation and review process should precede the selection of new projects. There are specific times where the CoC board may be more prescriptive in selecting projects, but the CoC should promote a fair and transparent competition for funds for the most part. Scoring, reallocation decisions, and new project selection should occur before ranking. It's not helpful to try to rank projects until you have the full list of projects that will need to be ranked. Some parts of the process can take place concurrently. All policies can be adopted at the same time. This is the strategy for the Delaware CoC. Your CoC's funding policies cover different aspects of the process and are compiled into a single document. Renewal project evaluation and scoring and new project solicitation and selection can run on parallel tracks, and often must do so in order to meet NOFO deadlines. Project evaluation is a significant responsibility of the funding committee, so let's do a quick review of what this entails. Project evaluation covers the following: review and evaluation of new project applications, along with the review and evaluation of renewal project performance. As we discussed in earlier slides, HUD encourages the use of an objective, data-driven approach for evaluating projects. This typically involves looking at performance outcomes, especially for renewal projects. In terms of the outcomes the CoC is reviewing, they should be related to performance measures aligned with the CoC's goals and priorities, particularly with the goal of ending homelessness in Delaware. Additionally, the CoC should consider performance measures that are aligned with HUD's policy priorities. Also, as part of the project evaluation process, the funding committee may recommend the placement of projects on quality improvement based on performance and/or compliance issues. Let's break down the process of evaluating, scoring, and ranking renewal projects. First, HAD as the lead agency and the funding committee will develop application and scoring tools and release them to grantees. Agencies then have time to gather and submit their application materials. Projects are reviewed by HAD for threshold compliance, and HAD conducts preliminary scoring. The funding committee will then meet to review scoring overall and specific scoring issues. Once that is complete, the committee will approve final scores to recommend to the non-conflicted board. Scoring is then sent for review and a vote by the non-conflicted board members. Final evaluation outcomes and scores are sent to the grantees. Grantees have the opportunity to submit appeals of scoring in accordance with the CoC's appeals policy. Once appeal decisions have been made by the non-conflicted board, the scores will be finalized. Upon final ranking decisions, final scores and ranking will be posted to the CoC's website. Another key role of the funding committee is to make reallocation decisions. As a reminder, reallocation is the process by which CoC funds, in part or in whole, are taken from an existing project to create a new project. It's important to keep in mind that CoC funds don't belong to grantees, and that the CoC has the responsibility of ensuring that CoC funds are going to projects that effectively serve those experiencing homelessness in ways that align with the CoC's and HUD's rules and priorities. As we discussed earlier, an agency may notify the CoC that it does not want to continue on with a project and will return the funds to the CoC. This is a voluntary reallocation, and the funding committee's role will be to help decide which new projects will receive those funds. There will also be times when the funding committee and the non-conflicted board will have a more active role in deciding to reallocate funds from existing projects so that they can be used for a new project. This kind of competitive reallocation is typically based on project performance, local need, compliance, and/or HEARTH Act measures. The funding committee and the non-conflicted board ultimately decide whether a partial or full reallocation is warranted in such cases. In recent years, the CoC has partially reallocated funds from renewal projects to help fund new projects that were seen as better meeting the needs of the CoC. The funding committee will also play a significant role in the selection of new projects. If funding is available, a new project solicitation is released. Funding might be made available by HUD through a CoC or DB bonus, or through the reallocation of funds from existing projects. New project funding doesn't have to be used on entirely new projects, but can also be used to expand existing projects. HUD will draft and release any new project solicitations, applications, and scoring tools that are needed. The CoC will aim to distribute the solicitation as widely as possible. HUD wants CoCs to demonstrate that they are open to new agencies as applicants. New project responses to the solicitation are reviewed and new project applicants are selected through the following process. HUD conducts a threshold review and reports any issues with applications to the funding committee. The funding committee conducts the review and scores the applications, then decides which applications to recommend for funding. The non-conflicted board members review those recommendations and make final approvals. After the applicants are notified of selection decisions, applicant agencies will have a limited appeal option. The non-conflicted board reviews any appeals and makes final decisions. The funding committee will have a sizable role in the ranking and prioritization of projects that are to be submitted to HUD. As we noted in an earlier slide, CoCs have to sort projects into Tier 1 and Tier 2, with Tier 2 projects at risk of not receiving funds. Project ranking determines the order of projects on the priority list and whether they will be in Tier 1 or Tier 2. Each project on the priority list will be numbered. A project ranked 1 on the priority list is at the top and considered to have the highest priority. The CoC will use project scoring as a general guide, but ranking involves strategy, and the CoC's priorities matter a great deal when it comes to determining the final ranking for the priority list. So, once renewal projects have been evaluated and scored, reallocations have been determined, and new projects have been scored and selected, the process of ranking the projects can begin. The process starts with the funding committee reviewing various ranking scenarios. These scenarios are developed by HUD and the CoC consultant and are heavily based on project scoring, but will also incorporate CoC priorities and try to maximize the CoC's competitiveness for funds. Once the funding committee makes a final recommendation regarding a ranking scenario, it is then sent to the non-conflicted board for review and discussion. The non-conflicted board will approve the final ranking to be used for the CoC's priority lists. The final ranking is then posted on the CoC's website and shared with all applicants. Compliance with the CoC standards and HUD regulations is reviewed by Housing Alliance Delaware. Any compliance issues or concerns that are identified through the project evaluation process will be brought to the funding committee for review and discussion. Significant issues may also be brought to the non-conflicted members of the CoC board. One final responsibility of the funding committee to review relates to quality improvement plans or QIPs. It is within the funding committee's role to determine which projects will be placed on a QIP after the annual renewal project evaluation and scoring process. A QIP provides a clearly documented plan to address concerning issues related to threshold, compliance, performance, need, and/or priority alignment. Projects placed on a QIP are required to implement the changes and/or action items outlined within the QIP to address the issues identified by the funding committee. The CoC lead, which is HAD, is responsible for developing and administering the QIP with the project's leadership and for monitoring progress on completion. Agencies are advised that placement on a QIP and QIP outcomes may affect a project's score and rank during subsequent CoC funding competitions. If you have questions about the process or anything presented here, feel free to reach out to the HAD staff. Thank you for reviewing this presentation. On behalf of the HAD staff, we hope you found it useful and that it will help you prepare for your role on the funding committee this coming year.